Mr. Speaker, this House believes that states should compensate criminals who are acquitted on appeal. On side government, we believe that no matter what you do, even if you have done your best, Mr. Speaker, if a wrong was committed, if a mistake was made, compensation still has to be paid to the innocent party that had suffered the harm, Mr. Speaker. This is what we stand for on side government. Compensation of harm that were inflicted. But what do we mean by compensation? By compensation, we mean the monetary compensation that covers the legal costs and also damages for the time that person spent in prison during, during that time that after the initial trial, Mr. Speaker. And we believe that this compensation includes the calculus of, the form of income that you had before you went to jail and the projection of how the income was increased, as well as, whatever calculus that in the law that is already in place for the calculation of damages for any particular wrong. On appeal, what is an appeal? In order to explain this, Speaker, we have to look at the initial trial. In the initial trial, you argue based on the facts to prove whether or not you did what you did. If you are guilty and then you believe that you shouldn't have been given that particular verdict, that is when you move on to an appeal. In which case, within an appeal, you argue based on the law. You argue whether or not the procedures were followed during your initial trial. You argue whether the judge used the correct legal principles in the initial trial. And you believe that and whether or not you were judged accordingly in that initial trial. And you believe that if any of that appeal falls on your side, it goes to show that a mistake did in fact occur in the initial trial, a harm was inflicted, and you deserve to be compensated for it, Mr. Speaker. What am I going to talk to you about within my speech? I'm going to talk to you about two things, right? Why compensation is justified, and the harms that come if we do not provide this compensation. On the importance of why compensation is justified, we first have to analyze the characteristic of the mistake, right? If in an appeal you win, as I said before, there isn't an admission of a legal error that occurred in the initial trial. The legal error could be on the part of the judge, on the procedural part of the investigation that occurred, and so on and so forth. We have to remember the importance that if a mistake did happen on that part, there has to be a form of repercussions. There has to be a form of compensation because of that particular mistake. Why? Because it's important to uphold and to ensure that in future mistakes don't happen. That future mistakes don't happen. Because these mistakes result in a detraction of fairness within that initial trial. Hence, that trial was then done without fairness, and injustice was done to you because there was no proper application of justice, and for that you were imprisoned, for that you received your punishment. Definitely a mistake was made, Mr. Speaker, and because of that, you deserve compensation. And furthermore, what is the result of that particular mistake? If we look at the example of Anwar Ibrahim, right, within Malaysia, he was convicted of sodomy, right? But then, when finally acquitted, he had spent 6 years in jail, Mr. Speaker. 6 years of his life that he will never get back, Mr. Speaker. He will never get back the 6 years he's supposed to spend with his family. He's supposed to campaign for the rights of the people that he was fighting for as a politician. He wasn't able to provide and make a living, Mr. Speaker. And you believe there is no way for you to recover all of that. And this is the damage that was inflicted, and you should compensate for it. You believe that at the end of the day, justice is being fair. And if indeed you suffered from harm, you deserve to be compensated. Like if you're willing to push for companies like Toyota, that even when they did their best, they still had to recall their product because of the defect. Why is it that we cannot apply the same principle to the judiciary system? The judiciary that's supposed to uphold the fairness and justice towards the people. Before I continue on to my second point, please.
Is it the intent of a fair justice system to wrong the person in this way?
It is not the intent of the judicial system to inflict unfairness upon these people, Mr. Speaker. But you have to understand that there are instances where the rule of law, where you have to judge based on the rule of law, Mr. Speaker. And if in fact we find in the later process that a wrong was committed, that doesn't take away from the fact that the compensation deserves to be given, right? So the second point is the harm. What are the harms that happen if compensation is not provided, right? We have to look at the nature of what an acquittal is. in the public perspective, an acquittal doesn't necessarily mean you did the crime. Especially, it doesn't exactly mean that you are no longer guilty of the crime. Because if you look at, say, in a case of a famous crime, the people and finding that person was convicted, people will still think that he is the criminal, that he did the crime, even though within the appeal he was judged as not guilty. And this public perception, Mr. Speaker, when he is released, cannot be changed automatically. We look at this case of O.J. Simpson, right? He was convicted of murder, but even under appeal, when he was finally acquitted, no one believed that he was actually innocent, even though the rule of law states that he didn't, Mr. Speaker. We believe that on this part, two things happen. Firstly, a severance package is important for you. The severance package, in terms of that compensation, is important for you to jumpstart your life, right? Because after all of that, when you leave jail, Mr. Speaker, and not receive any form of compensation, you have to go back to that public and start making a living. You have to go back to the community and start building a new life. And this is difficult when people still believe you to be someone who has committed that crime, when people still believe you as someone who is, who probably should be stigmatized by society. But before I continue any further, one POI.
Is there a fundamental element of the justice system leading up to the appeal that you think is broken and we must change?
Mr. Speaker, this system isn't about changing the judicial process, but adding into it the idea of compensation for wrong that is committed. That's what the judicial process is about. I don't know why they have a problem about upholding something that we truly believe in, right? On the second part, the family also suffers when you have a family member who was initially convicted of a crime, right? What kind of stigma does that make you when you are a son whose father probably committed murder, or a wife whose husband committed battery, right? The stigma still falls upon you, and you as a family member also deserve that when that particular family member comes back, that there's some form of compensation, on your behalf, that he can now provide for you that he's back, right? We believe that this is also important to compensate. It's also important to compensate for that. At the end of the day, if the compensation doesn't happen, it's difficult for them to restart their life and get back into society. And this is important in order to uphold the fact that this person didn't do anything wrong. And now when you come back, you want to further his punishment by facing the public stigma that he faces once he's released. But what have we told you today, Mr. Speaker? Essentially, we told you to further uphold the system of justice, right? If a mistake was made, it doesn't matter even if you did your best. It doesn't matter if you feel that you have done everything you can. But if a mistake was still made, Mr. Speaker, it still means that compensation should be given to the party that has suffered the harm. And with that, the Side government is proud to propose.
Straight into the debate, Mr. Speaker. We will not compensate any applicant of a successful appeal. We accept that individuals can seek out civil recourse in the case that there was negligence on a certain party or intent to harm, meaning that if a police department or police officers beat a confession out of you, or the papers after you were put in trial claimed you as a child molester and now you're damaged record, you can sue the police department in a civil court, you can sue those newspapers for damaging your reputation. But if it so happens that as a side effect of the judicial process, you ended up suffering some losses, we're afraid to say that you can't take anything from the system. And we think we have some very good reasons for it. We say, if there are inadequacies within the system, although we didn't get any answer from them on that, we are more than happy to fix it. But we think as the system is now, leading up to the point of appeal, there are adequate checks and balances and put in place to ensure that no person who is actually put in prison is put in there for a completely unreasonable reason. We prove things beyond reasonable doubt before we sanction anyone and put them in prison or put any other form of punishment on them. We don't see why this proposal is particularly necessary. Our stance in today's debate is that we need to keep the status quo because it protects the integrity of our justice system and our being the operative keyword here. I'm going to talk about it on 4 levels. Firstly, how there are adequate checks and balances. Secondly, on the harm to dispensation of justice that they're proposing. supposed to have put in place. Thirdly, on an unfair expectation of the system. And finally, how it disproportionately privileges individuals over society and the justice system. My second speaker, NC, will talk about the nature of appeals, about civic perception, and also how this will remove a deterrent factor towards being involved in crime. Very quickly into the rebuttals on their material. We have a few questions about their models. They didn't set any caps, or also the idea of how you determine how much damage has been done to you by the public exposure. We say these amounts, it's not a big deal, but these amounts could be astronomical. Secondly, they didn't talk to us about whether this is possibly retrogressive. So is every person who's got an appeal in the past going to be able to apply for this? But never mind, we'll assume it's the best model possible, right? Let's talk about the material. They talked about this idea of deterrent. They said this, we need to do this because the justice system needs to pay for its crime. But we said before you punish anyone for anything, there are two elements to it. Yes, there is a factual act that happened, but there's also intent. It was not the intent of the justice system to actually harm this person. The intent was the pursuit of the truth, the protection of society, and the dispensation of justice. It just so happened that something failed. And we say it's an unreasonable burden to put on a system that is made of humans to be completely perfect all the time. We say, Mr. Speaker, that's unfair. But more so, if someone makes a mistake, we think there should be a price to pay. But not by not giving money to a person. That person should be fired. If an officer hid evidence or left it in the fridge till it went bad, Mr. Speaker, that's where the system needs to be fixed. But you don't pay someone, because we're happy to put money into fixing the system. Money that we might not have if you're paying off people for why you are appealed. Finally, they talked about the harm. When they talked about, first they talked about O.J. Simpson. Okay, O.J. Simpson didn't go to appeal. He was charged and acquitted in the court of law. But even if we talk about it, we agree. We agree that it will provide positive benefits to the individual. You're of course paying them. Of course they'll be happy. Who doesn't like money? But what we're saying is, it has to be outweighed against a trade-off. And that's where I'm going to go into my material. Firstly, there are adequate checks and balances within the system. It is not a random process of picking up someone, pushing them through the process, and throwing them in prison. What we have is, firstly, investigations have to be approved by district attorneys and supervising officers. Adequate evidence procedures have to be followed. Even when officers make arrests, there are KPIs now in most Western liberal democracy police departments, where individuals have to, it's not just whether you arrest someone, it's the rate of conviction that occurs as well. Furthermore, we say warrants are introduced for arrest, as well as introduced for how you gather that evidence. So a wiretap or being able to interrogate someone. More so than that, we say in most cases of criminal cases that result felonies, there are grand juries as well to determine whether adequate evidence has been gathered to put someone to trial. Finally, there is the jury and the trial process itself, where there's a layer that protects people in the, where you have to prove things beyond reasonable doubt. Juries aren't supposed to assume guilt, they assume innocent. The burden is put on the state to prove it. And we say all these burdens are stacked in the favor of the individual. All Western liberal democracies set their justice systems up to let with guilty men walk free if at the cost of not having one innocent man put in jail. Yes, sir.
So we agree, nobody intends to screw up and check and balance are there. But what do you do about the damages to a person who spends time in jail?
That's a cute question. I'll talk a bit about it in a second, right? I'll get into about these damages. Because those damages, right, the way you make it seem, right, is these damages are there. But the damages, of course, are there. It's a question of what you trade off in the process. It's a cheap question to go, someone's damaged. Because it's part of the system. And this is it. There are tangible harms to the system if you go through that process on two ways. On the first level, we think there are tangible harms in terms of taking money out of improving the system. Furthermore, we say what's going to happen in this case is one of two things. And one is harmful to society, the other is harmful to the person who's seeking an appeal. Firstly, in the case of society, essentially what will happen now in trials is when individuals are charged, judges will choose to be extra cautious so that they don't have to pay for damages. They will take, can you imagine a headline that shows up, Judge X trial overturned and he has to pay 10 million. That's not what any judge, particularly in systems where judges are elected, wants to hear about themselves. Furthermore, we think it damages the criminal because in courts of appeal, there's a new factor that's taken into account before you acquit someone. Before the appeal can be successful, it's no longer a question of whether there was a procedural problem, but an actual cost to the state. Do you want to be the judge that released that because of a mistrial lets a mobster out and also pays him money? Now, we accept this might not be the best thing, but it's something that can happen in the system. Finally, in terms of these ideas, because this is the balance I talk about, this is where the balance of right comes in. Firstly, we say it's an unfair expectation of the system to prove things 100% of the time. We think things like new evidence cropping up, new techniques of determining innocence and guilt are not anything that a system can predict. Finally, we say it disproportionately privileges individuals. We expect the justice system to protect us. We rely on that system, and these individuals who are also harmed relied on the system in the past to keep them safe. Part of that process is that sometimes we have this cost, but it's a cost we bear together as society. We have a responsibility, therefore, to acknowledge while this cost is there, the system works. We rely on our police departments, we rely on our justice systems to keep criminals off the street. And part of that process is sometimes some people who are not criminals might have to go through an unpleasant process. We accept this in terms of bringing in people to interview for evidence, Mr. Speaker. And we say in that case, this is another cost of the system, a cost that outweighs the harms that come to the individual. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, for your justice system and for my justice system, we're proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader, for position for the speech. Further case for compensate and compensate by the discuss now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Because we say that the good intent is not enough when damage occurs. When you go to the jail, when you are possibly annually raped in that jail, when you lose, like they say, hundreds of thousands of annual income, Mr. Speaker, the question is, what do we do to help that person? Because most of the state's speech, Mr. Speaker, was only how the justice works and how justice is already there, checks, proper checks and balances. We agree, Mr. Speaker, that justice is already trying to protect this. But the question is, how do we help that person when the justice fails? Mr. Speaker, we think that this person needs compensation and reparation, and they didn't engage with our case on that level. So, Mr. Speaker, what did they tell us? They said that judges will be overly cautious. But we say, Mr. Speaker, firstly, that's good. We think the judges should work their job well, and they should actually meticulously investigate every piece of evidence, Mr. Speaker. Why is this important? Because, like we see now on the Wall Street, Mr. Speaker, in the case of insider trading, where state prosecutor is trying to so vigorously prosecute the people who committed insider trading cases, Mr. Speaker, we think that equally they have to be responsible, when it comes about their failures. So, Mr. Speaker, we think that just adds better incentive for them to do job better. Second example to this, let's just look at the African Americans in the US. It's already shown that the judges are more likely to convict African Americans, Mr. Speaker. We think these cases already exist, justice is not enough, and it's good if the judge is actually additionally cautious about the results of his charges. Secondly, they tell us, well, there is already a clash of rights, and how the state is not responsible to pay any additional reparation. But we say it's not true, Mr. Speaker, because on the basis of the social contract, state is already trying to actually ensure the equality of all citizens. When that equality is not achieved, then the state is actually trying to get compensation. In the cases, again, of African Americans in the US, who were actually before discriminated, Mr. Speaker, by the US by the government, Mr. Speaker, the state recognized its mistakes, Mr. Speaker, and then gave affirmative policies. That's why we see how the state actually has the responsibility to ensure the justice for its citizens. Clash of rights falls on our side. Yes, thank you.
Is it the position of this government, therefore, that justice should be more lenient for African Americans?
Not true. We say justice has to prosecute its job as, both sides of the House agree that the judges have to do their job as best as possible. The question in this debate is how do we help those people who are wrongfully convicted, Mr. Speaker? Because if that person loses the income, if it severs all his family relationships, if it actually you go missing for a few years, Mr. Speaker, the question is, what do we do about that person? They didn't answer to that. Which leads me to my argumentation, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to tell you two things. I'm going to tell you how this increases the confidence in judiciary, number one. And secondly, I'm going to tell you how it actually compels judges to actually to compels judges to do a better job. Something that's already in the clash with the previous point. So, Mr. Speaker, on the first point, we say that this increases the confidence in judiciary. What we see now, Mr. Speaker, is that the people are already scared to go for a trial because they know that the mistakes happen and sometimes they can wrongfully get convicted. Sit down. So in these cases, people sometimes get desperate and they do many stupid things. Like they try to run away, Mr. Speaker, because they know also in the cases of racial minorities that the judiciary system is not towards them, Mr. Speaker. But we say many people are just simply freaked out with the situation of going for a trial and they're scared of that. Sometimes they get desperate. So, Mr. Speaker, we think this is very important. When the person knows that even if you go for a trial, that if the mistake is later on happen, you will be compensated and you will actually be helped. That the society will try to help you to get you back into normal life and at least try to monetarily compensate you. We think people will be much more comfortable on the P and the P's with the justice, Mr. Speaker. Sit down, Kate. They will be much more comfortable with the idea of going for a trial, and they will not try to do stupid things. They will not try to run away, and we think it's very important. Now, before I move on, yes, Kate.
Sir, are you saying that if a victim of a crime calls 911 and the state doesn't show up in time, the state should also pay them money for the damage they suffered?
I mean, I'm not sure how that falls into debate anyway, but we say if you're found that during your trial and you're acquitted on appeal, Mr. Speaker, if there was a mistake, it's not like they're blaming the judiciary. We can say maybe it was unintentional mistake, but simply we're trying to help that person, Mr. Speaker, who now tries to get back to the society. They are not showing anything. How are they going to help to those people? That's the thing. They didn't engage with that, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, and this is something I already talked about, it actually compels judiciary to do their job better. Because let's look at the cases of the poor people, Mr. Speaker, because not everybody is rich like the O.J. Simpson. Something already happened. In the cases of poor people, when you don't have money to pay a good lawyer, Mr. Speaker, what happens? The judge or the court just assigns you any lawyer, Mr. Speaker, and his legal aid is of questionable quality. Mr. Speaker, we think in these cases it's much harder that this kind of person will get better or the high quality representation in court. We think this actually pushes additional incentive on the court and judiciary to ensure that everybody gets quality representation in the cases and in the trials, Mr. Speaker. Because why, Mr. Speaker? If they show that too much money went for the claims, of the compensation, they will know that something is wrong and they will also be asked to justify all this money that's spent for the compensation. So we think that in that case, court will have additional incentive to work better, Mr. Speaker, and to ensure better justice. So at the end of the day, what do we have, Mr. Speaker? As we already said, this debate is about what do we do about mistakes and how do we help those people who are the victims of even unintentional mistakes. Opposition didn't tell you anything. How are they helping these people? What we tell you, even if it was unintentional mistakes, principles still exist. These people still deserve compensation, and this is how we are helping them. That's the least we can do, and we are very proud to propose.